Well, hello everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Uncivil Law, the channel where we learn from the mistakes of others. As always, if you're enjoying our legal education content, please remember to subscribe. It helps our channel grow. For today's live stream, we are doing a decision from a advisory board at Facebook. So this is what Facebook at least calls its Supreme Court. So let's go with that. Anyway, so here's the long and short. So Facebook created a board that is supposed to be independent of Facebook that reviews decisions. I don't know how they exactly get the cases, but somehow, and their decisions are binding or something on Facebook. I don't know exactly how it's set up internally. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of today's exercise. What does matter for the purposes of today's exercise is that they have come out with a decision regarding Facebook's ban of Trump and the aftermath of the January 6th riots at the Capitol. So, like Twitter, Facebook, well, they didn't ban. Twitter banned him for life. Facebook suspended his account with an indefinite duration, and that decision was reviewed by Facebook's internal Supreme Court, or quasi-internal or quasi-independent or whatever Supreme Court. So we're going to review their decision. So we're going to review it like a legal decision as best as we're able. So we will read the rules that apply. We will try to determine the degree to which we agree or disagree with the application of the rules, and we'll also, question the underlying logic and the underlying consistency of the decision and what it might speak to the future, and whether or not this process is a good process for social media companies to follow, whether or not what Facebook is doing or attempt to doing is better than the alternatives, which it almost certainly is, given the alternatives are whatever Jack Dorsey says or the equivalent. So we'll see if it's at least leading to better results. So let's get started with this. So we're going to review this decision. Super duper. And we're going to start with the end of the decision, because at the end of the decision, they actually state the rule. This is the rule that Facebook has. So when we're trying to figure out the issue, so we'll do this in sort of quasi-Iraq style, right? Issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, right? So the issue is, should Trump be banned off Facebook, either temporarily or permanently? That's the issue. So now that we know the issue, what is the rule, right? All right, so let's read the rule. This is the rule. The rule is called Dangerous Individuals and Organizations. Here's the substance of the rule. In an effort to prevent and disrupt real-world harm, we do not allow any organizations or individuals that proclaim a violent mission or are engaged in violence to have a presence on Facebook. Organizations or individuals that proclaim a violent mission. Okay. This includes organizations or individuals involved in the following: terrorist activity, organized hate, mass murder, including attempts of or multiple murder, human trafficking, organized violence, or criminal activity. We also remove content that expresses support or praises for groups, leaders, or individuals involved in those activities. So presumably, Trump being disciplined under this rule means that he is definitionally, because this is the definition we're applying, right? This means that Trump is definitionally an individual that proclaims a violent mission that's informed by presumably organized violence or criminal activity, or his support or praise for groups, leaders, and individuals involved in organized violence or criminal activity. So that's supposedly the rule. Okay, so now that we know the rule, let's analyze whether or not Trump falls into this somewhat amorphous rule based on the analysis as provided by this board. And I'll just read the whole thing, including let's skip, because I think this is just all executive summary. All right, so let's just skip the executive summary, because we're going to treat it like we do the syllabus of the Supreme Court, where if we read the syllabus, we don't read the decision. If we read the decision, we don't read the syllabus, because the syllabus is supposed to theoretically just restate the decision in shorter, easier to understand words. But today I'm not interested in easier, shorter to understand words. I'm interested in the full decision. So let's read it. Okay, here's the full case decision. In this case, Facebook asked the board to answer 2 questions. Considering Facebook's values, specifically its commitment to voice and safety, did it correctly decide on January 7, 2021, to prohibit Donald John Trump access to posting content on Facebook and Instagram for an indefinite period of time? In addition to the board's determination on whether to uphold or overturn the indefinite suspension, Facebook welcomes observations or recommendations from the board about suspensions when the user is a political leader. So, first of all, just in terms of the question presented is not really the rule that applies. This question presented is not really tied to the rule. And also the rule that the board analyzes is not the question that Facebook asked. The rule the board goes with is the terrorist violence thing. And Facebook asked the question about commitment to voice and safety, which I note are not the same thing. So from a purely technical level, the court or the board could have answered this question just simply with no, because you asked the wrong question, which courts do on a not infrequent basis, which is why asking the right question is so important in law. Asking the right question is probably the most dominant thing in law. All things considered, it's probably the most important thing is asking the right question. So you didn't ask the right question is kind of notable. But anyways, let's analyze the question that we asked, I suppose. The board upholds Facebook's decision on January 7th, 2021 to restrict then-President Donald Trump's access to posting content on his Facebook page and Instagram account. However, it was not appropriate for Facebook to impose the indeterminate and standard list penalty of indefinite suspension. Okay. Facebook's normal penalties include removing violent content, imposing a time-bound period of suspension, or permanently disabling the page and account. So this is pretty interesting. So the board says your indefinite suspension is some sort of no man's land between these things. So you didn't disable the account, you suspended the account. And in the past, there's no such thing as an indefinite suspension. And the board is implicitly asking the question, what is the difference between indefinite suspension and permanently disabling? Which is a perfectly fair question. So the board seems to be saying, there's not enough daylight between these two things, so yeah. The board insists that Facebook review this matter to determine and justify a proportionate response that's consistent with the rules as applied to other users of its platform. Facebook must complete its review of this matter within 6 months of the date of this decision, or what, one wonders. The board also makes policy recommendations for Facebook to implement in developing a clear, necessary, and proportional policies that promote public safety and respect freedom of expression. So this is pretty interesting because this board is both a court and also sort of an advisory legislative thing, which the Supreme Court doesn't normally provide recommendations on the law on how it should change. They just say your law is bad, go fix it. They don't normally say, here's how specifically to fix it. That's not usually something that courts do. In fact, there's a pretty big debate in legal circles about whether it's ever appropriate to even do that, because there's the whole separation of powers thing. So is it acceptable, for example, for a judge as part of their decision to say, I can't relieve this person legally, but the governor should pardon? Can the judge write that? Or is it proper for the judge to write that because it's, I can't fix this, but the legislature should change the law, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of debate about whether or not that's okay or not. And there's some fairly decent argument for no. But apparently this board has no problem with that. This board has no problem with it. We are judges, and we're also going to provide you, the Facebook, who is the legislature in this example, in terms of specific things you should do. Okay. Case description. Elections are a crucial part of democracy. They allow people throughout the world to govern and resolve social conflicts peacefully. In the United States of America, the Constitution says the president is selected by counting electoral college votes. On January 6, 2021, during the counting of the 2020 electoral votes, a mob forcibly entered the Capitol where electoral votes were being counted and threatened the constitutional process. 5 people died and many more were injured during the violence. Well, only one person really died from the events that we've been able to determine. That would be the person who was shot by the police. The other 4 people seem to be disconnected from the event, as best as anyone can determine. So to say 5 people died is not necessarily a fair characterization. For example, one of those people was the police officer whose autopsy results were recently announced. And they said, yeah, it's due to a stroke, which they were unable to tie to the riots. To say that they were died as a result of the violence is misleading at best. Prior to January 6th, then President Donald Trump had asserted without evidence that the November 2020 presidential election had been stolen. Legal claims brought by Mr. Trump and others of election fraud were rejected in over 70 cases, and the then Attorney General, after investigation, said there had been no fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election, which, for better or worse, is also my conclusion. To say there is no fraud is ridiculous. To say that there's no fraud on a scale that could have affected the election is an accurate statement based on my assessment of the cases as well. Nevertheless, Mr. Trump continued to make these unfounded claims, including through Facebook, and referred to a rally planned for January 6th. On December the 19th of 2020, the Trump Facebook page posted, Peter Navarro releases a 36-page report alleging election fraud more than sufficient to swing the victory to Trump. A great report by Peter. Statistically improbable to have lost the 2020 election. Big protest in D.C. on the 6th. Be there. We'll be wild. As it's been a long time since I read the statistical stuff, but as memory serves correctly, the statistical stuff was crap too. I don't remember why it was crap, because it's been a long time, but as memory serves, that was also BS, because they were asking like the wrong numbers or doing the wrong calculation. I remember some of these calculations that were being done where it was saying the odds of the election being that way were 1 in like 3 quintillion or quadrillion or some ridiculous number like that. As memory serves, because they were basing it off of assumptions that were not valid. They were basing it off of previous election results, but the problem was this election was different in the way people voted. More people voted mail-in and less people voted in person, so the numbers they were using were skewed, and I don't remember the exact details, but I remember it was kind of crap when you actually got into it. On January the 1st, 2021, the Trump Facebook page posted the big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal. Okay. On the morning of January the 6th, Mr. Trump attended a rally near the White House and gave a speech. It was in the Ellipse, wasn't it? Wasn't it on the White House grounds? Whatever. He continued to make unfounded claims that he won the election and suggested Vice President Mike Pence should overturn President-elect Joe Biden's victory, a power Mr. Pence does not have. Yeah. He also stated, we will stop the steal and we're going to the Capitol. Many of those attending the rally then marched to the U.S. Capitol building, where they joined other protesters already gathered. And protesting is legal, right? I don't have any problem with protesting. I have a lot of problem with people breaking laws and breaking property and trespassing and violence and all the rest of it. But I have no problem with people protesting. Protesting is good. People should be allowed to protest for anything they want, even if I don't believe in it. Perhaps especially if I don't believe in it. So people going to protest in the Capitol was perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. The other aspects, less so. Many of the protesters attacked the Capitol security. I suppose it depends how you define many, which is maybe not a fair characterization, because about 1,000 people, maybe a little less. I forget what the exact numbers were estimated at. I think the estimate was 800, give or take. I don't know if that estimate has been revised. In terms of people that actually breached the Capitol, 800 people haven't been charged, but the FBI had estimated about 800, which seems like a reasonable estimate based on the videos that we have seen. Seems like a reasonable guess. Whether or not we'll be able to prosecute 800 people in the end, who knows? But 800 out of how many people were there? There was 100,000 people plus at the Stop the Steal rally. So you're talking under 1%. So I don't know if that's many or not. Depends on how you're defining many. If you're defining it in terms of raw number or you're defining it in terms of percentage. It was, by at least the left standards, it was a mostly peaceful protest. The way that the left-hand side of the aisle seems to treat these things, it was mostly peaceful. For most of the day, all the protesters weren't breaking the law, and then the ones that did break the law was a very small minority. So using the left standard, this would be a mostly peaceful protest. So, although I think the left standard is crap, because that's dumb. And it's dumb when the left says it. I'll just point out that there's inconsistencies in their view. Less inconsistent on my view. Because I think it's bad when BLM Antifa does it, and I also think it's bad when whoever it was stormed the Capitol did it. I don't really care if it's BLM Antifa or if it's the right. Don't really care either way. Doesn't matter to me. Either way, it's bad. That's what happens when you try to have consistency, right? It's always bad. It's always bad when people do the violence, the breaking, the entering, the arson, the violence. It's always bad. Key. Many of the protesters attacked the Capitol security, violently entered the building, and rioted throughout the Capitol. Mr. Pence and other members of Congress were placed at serious risk of targeted violence. I think that's fair. 5 people died. That's not as fair as we pointed out. And many people were injured. To say 5 people died, I think, is wrong. That 5 people have a temporal connection, but 5 people have a causal connection. One person we are pretty sure doesn't have a causal connection, at least one we can't prove. And the other three, other than the person who was shot, are equally dubious. So, I don't know about that one. During these events, Mr. Trump posted a video and statement to his Facebook page, which had at least 35 million followers, and the video was shared to Instagram, which has at least 24 million followers. The post stated the 2020 election was stolen and stripped away. The post also praised and supported those who were at the time rioting inside the Capitol, while also calling on them to remain peaceful, which seems like a good thing. I mean, please remain peaceful seems good. Both the Facebook page and Instagram account show a blue tick next to the page or account name, meaning that Facebook had confirmed the account is the authentic presence of the public figure it represents. Right, it's from who it purports to be from. Correct. That is what it means. In the 1-minute video posted at 4:21 Eastern Standard Time as the riot continued, which by 4:21 p.m., I don't know if the riot was still continuing in any meaningful sense or not, but whatever. Mr. Trump stated, "I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anyone hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it all away from us, from me, from you, from our country. This is a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You've seen the way others are treated. That's so bad and so evil. I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace." Which, I don't know about you, but at least on the transcript seems pretty moderated, if not the right message. So, we love you and all, but go home in peace, stop the rioting. We can't do this. It's not becoming of us. We can't play into their hands. So, seems like a reasonably good message, at least on the transcript, right? At 5:41 p.m. Eastern Time, Facebook removed this post for violating community standards on dangerous individuals and organizations. Mr. Trump wrote the following post at 6:07 p.m. as the police were securing the Capitol. "There are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously, viciously stripped away from great patriots who've been badly, unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and peace." Again, calling for peace. Also, I would take a bit of exception to say it was unceremoniously stripped away. It was very ceremoniously stripped away, one would argue. So, I'm not sure about unceremoniously, but whatever. At 6:15 p.m. Eastern Time, Facebook removed this post for violating its community standards on dangerous individuals and organizations. Why? Given the standards that we saw before, is he supporting or people who are doing bad things? I mean, he's saying go home with peace. I don't know. On January the 7th of 2021, after further reviewing Mr. Trump's post, his recent communications off Facebook, and additional information about the severity of the violence at the Capitol, Facebook extended the block indefinitely and at least for the next 2 weeks until the peaceful transfer of power is completed. Facebook cited Mr. Trump's use of the platform to incite violent insurrection against democratically elected government. Not that they necessarily need to use the legal standard, and hopefully at some point they will say how they're defining incitement. That would be nice. But legally, is this incitement? No, it's not incitement. Incitement has a legally defined meaning. It requires you to do something that is going to cause an imminent threat of law breaking, and to encourage that actively, to actively encourage it, and to incite it. So to incite something is, I want you to do an illegal thing, and I want you to do it right now. So one takes note, incidentally, from this definition, and this is legally correct, that you can, in general, tell people to break the law. In general. Let's rephrase it. Not to tell people to break the law. That's a bad way of phrasing it. What would be a better way of phrasing it? You can, in general, advocate that people should break the law. That's probably better. People in general, not specific people, but people in general. It would be good for people to, do whatever, right? That's fine. That's protected speech. If you're talking to a specific person, you might have a problem. But if you're talking to an unamorphous general population, that's okay. As long as it's not going to happen right now. So we should gather here tomorrow and riot. That speech is protected. Now, when you actually start gathering to riot, less so, but we're not then getting you for the speech now, are we? We're getting you for the attempt to riot, because now you're gathering to riot. And we have pretty good an idea of what you're doing because you've announced your intention in advance. So we definitely have probable cause, right? So you can say it would be good for us to come here tomorrow and riot. That speech is protected. If people start arriving tomorrow to riot, however, those people are going to be arrested for attempting to riot. And the probable cause is looking pretty decent, but that's not the speech. So yeah, but we should riot right now, not so much. So hopefully at some point they'll define what incitement means, because legally it's not incitement, nor is it even close in my humble legal opinion. In the days that followed January 6th, some of the participants in the riot stated publicly that they did so at the behest of the president. Well, those people are idiots. They heard the dog talking through the radio. I don't know what to tell you. One participant was quoted in the Washington Post. I thought I was following my president. He asked us to fly there. He did. He asked us to be there. He did. So I was doing what he asked us to do. No, you weren't. You were half correct. He did ask you to fly there. He did ask you to be there. You did other things. Now, didn't you? A video captured the rioter on the steps of the Capitol screaming at a police officer, "We were invited here." Yes, you were. We were invited by the President of the United States. Yes, you were. To protest. The District of Columbia declared a public emergency on January 6th and extended it until January 21st the same day. Perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. On January the 27th, the Department of Homeland Security issued a National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin, which is a pretty cool name actually, warning of heightened threat of environment across the United States, which the Department of Homeland Security believes will persist in the weeks following the inauguration, which is a pretty reasonable assessment, all things considered, especially at the time. It states that drives to be violent will remain through early 2021, and some domestic violent extremists may be emboldened by the January 6th breach of the Capitol in Washington to target elected officials and government facilities. That seems like a perfectly reasonable projection from a security standpoint. right? If your goal is security, and your goal is is guessing on security threats, one would imagine this is a perfectly reasonable conclusion. There might be other conclusions that are reasonable. To say this is a reasonable conclusion doesn't mean it's necessarily the only reasonable conclusion, but it's a reasonable conclusion. People might be emboldened by this. There might be threats to other public officials. There is an increased threat profile. These seems like plausible conclusions to my mind, especially at the time the Department of Homeland Security is writing this. While the post at Facebook found they violate the current policies, content policies were removed. Mr. Trump's Facebook page and Instagram account remain publicly accessible on Facebook and Instagram. I also like how my live chat in my browser is just not working for me. I know it's working for you, but it's not working for me. So if you're talking to me, I apologize because I can't see it. Anyways. While the post that Facebook found, there's no notice on the page or account of restrictions that Facebook opposed. On January 21st, Facebook announced that it referred the case to the Oversight Board. Okie doke. In addition to the 2 posts on January 6th, Facebook previously found 5 violations of community standards in organic content posted on the Donald John Trump Facebook page, 3 within the last year. The 5 violating posts were removed, but no account-level sanctions were applied. In response to the board's question on whether any strikes have been applied, Facebook said that the page received 1 strike for a post in August 2020, which violated COVID's mishandling and harm policy. Facebook did not explain why other violating content it removed did not result in strikes. Facebook has a newsworthiness allowance, which allows content that violates its policy to remain on platform if Facebook considers the content newsworthy and in the public interest, which seems perfectly fair. Affirmative nod, you're just being mean to me right now. Facebook asserts that never applied the newsworthiness allowance to content to the page or Instagram account. Really? It's never applied the newsworthiness allowance to content? Seems like a strange position for Facebook to take, but okay. Responding to the board's question, Facebook disclosed that there were 20 pieces of content from the Trump Facebook page and Instagram account that content reviewers or automation initially marked as violating Facebook community standards, but were only determined to not be violations. Facebook told the board that it applies a cross-check system to some high-profile accounts to minimize risk of error. That seems like a good plan. If it's particularly high-profile accounts, double-checking seems like a good idea. Not for the least of reasons that it might give you the ability to retrain or modify the tools, so the tools will be better. For these accounts, Facebook sends content found to violate its community standards for additional internal review. After this escalation, Facebook decides if the content is violating. Facebook told the board that it has never had a general rule that's more permissive for content posted by political leaders. That doesn't seem true based on what we saw before. While the same general rules apply, the cross-check system means the decision-making process are different from some high-profile users. Right, but that seems like a good thing because you would want to spot check your tools to make sure they're working correctly and figure out how to make the tools better. Whether it's automation or human, you want to spot check your tools to make sure they're working properly, right? That seems like just good management guidance 101. Whether or not you're managing human or automation, you want to make sure it's working properly. So you want to spot check. Okay, so what would you decide to spot check? Well, the most logical thing, or I don't know if it's the most logical thing, a logical thing to spot check would be the highest profile impacts, where if you got it wrong, it would have the most impact. That seems like a reasonable place to go. Let's check the things that, if we get it wrong, would have the most impact. So those would be the highest profile accounts. Those are the ones we're going to probably spot check more. Probably a kind of similar philosophy for the IRS for auditing. Who are you going to audit? All things being equal, the ones that seem like the most threat. It's just good management, seems to me. Authority and scope. The Oversight Board has the power to review a broad set of questions referred by Facebook. according to some charter, which maybe we'll read at some later time because maybe we can figure out exactly what this board is, but I don't really care right now. It doesn't matter. We're analyzing it for its legal application, such as it is, and also its logical consistency and also its wisdom. So the authority of this board, I don't really care at this moment. Decisions on these questions are binding and may include policy advisory statements with recommendations. The recommendations are non-binding, but Facebook must respond to them. The board is an independent grievance mechanism to address disputes in a transparent and principled manner. We'll take your word for it for the moment. Relevant standards. Under the Oversight Board Charter, it must consider all cases in light of the following standards. Facebook has community standards that describes what users are not allowed to post on Facebook, and Instagram has community guidelines that describe what users are not allowed to post on Instagram. Facebook's community standards on dangerous individuals and organizations prohibits content that praises, supports, or represents events that Facebook designates as terrorist attacks, hate events, mass murders or attempted mass murders, serial murders, hate crimes, and violating events. It also prohibits content that praises any of the above organizations or individuals or acts that are committed to them, referring to hate organizations and criminal organizations, among others. So I suppose we can assess ourselves initially whether this seems proper. Did Trump, in the post that we noted, did he praise, support, or represent a terrorist attack, hate event, mass murder, attempted mass murder, serial murder, hate crime, or violating event? I mean, not really, it seems to my mind. He supported people protesting, which is lawful. He supported people rallying, which is lawful. In his messages that he made after the fact, which might have been a little late in time, which is a valid point of criticism, but Facebook's policies don't say anything about not saying things. They only say things about saying things. So Facebook's policies do not allow them to punish Trump for not saying things, even if he should have, from some sort of moral level, or some sort of legal level for that matter. You could even go legally, because Trump has an oath to uphold the law. So maybe you could even say there's a legal obligation in there. That would make sense. But either way, it doesn't fall against Facebook's policies to not say something. So they can only punish him for the things he said. Well, what did he say? He said, we want peace. We want to uphold law and order. We don't want to be like them. Go home. Be peaceful. Was he praising, supporting, or representing bad stuff? It's not immediately obvious to my mind. Instagram's community guidelines state that Instagram is not a place to support or praise terrorism, organized crime, or hate groups, and provide a link to dangerous individuals and organizations' community standard. Facebook community standards on violent incitement states it removes content, disables accounts, works with law enforcement when it believes there's a genuine risk of physical harm or direct threat to public safety, which seems like a good thing to do. All things being considered, if there's actual threats of physical harm or threats to public safety, it is good for Facebook to contact the lawful authorities. That seems like a good thing to do, even if they're not obligated to, which they're almost certainly not. The standard specifically prohibits statements advocating for high severity violence, and any content containing statements of intent, calls for action, conditional or aspirational statements, or advocating for violence due to voting registration or administration, or outcome of the election. So one will take note here that Facebook's definitions are considerably broader than the legal definitions for incitement. Considerably. Not for a least of reasons, it doesn't have the temporal requirement that incitement legally does, which is a pretty big deal. Incitement has to be right now. So it's not enough to make statements advocating for violence. It's not enough legally. It's not enough to make statements for violence. It's not enough legally to make statements for intent, calls of action, conditional, or advocating for violence. That's not incitement legally. Especially, and again, it's important to note here that this only really applies if we're doing it in the broad. If we're doing it with specific people in mind or to a specific designated group of people, you might have other legal issues. For example, conspiracy would be the one that pops most obviously to mind, right? If you say to a specific person, it would be good for us to rob the bank, and they say, yes, it would be good for us to rob the bank. Well, my friends, you're well on your way to conspiracy at that point. But if you say to people in general, it would be good for people in general to rob the bank, it's not conspiracy. Why? Because you're not offering your participation. Right? But if you say to someone, it would be good for you to rob the bank, that could be understood to imply you're looking to participate pretty easily. So these are important distinctions to bear in mind. When you're playing with fire, you got to understand what the limits are pretty well. I'm just saying. Anyways, it also prohibits misinformation and unverifiable rumors that contribute to risk of imminent violent or physical harm, which again is much, much bigger than the legal definition. In fact, misinformation and rumor has basically zero to do with any legal definition that comes to mind. If you don't know it, if you know it, then you might have a problem. But, if you know for a fact that the bank is not giving away free money, but you tell people the bank is giving away free money if you show up with a mask and a gun, and someone believes you, that's probably something. They're going to charge you with something. But if somehow you are unaware at the time you said it that that's not true, and you have reason to believe it's not, if you have reason to believe it, then you might be okay. But, again, you may not necessarily want to play with these boundaries, because if you play on the lines, you might fall off. If you play on the cliff, you might fall off. That's actually a pretty good analogy, because I have trouble sometimes describing to people what is legal and what is illegal exactly, not for least of reasons, because it's difficult to describe exactly what's legal and illegal. And sometimes, although it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I'll get comments that say things along the lines of, well, that's not fair. I need to know exactly what's illegal and legal. And my response is, no, you really don't, because I can give you a 95, 98, 99% answer pretty easily. If you want answers that are more precise than that, then we get into increasing levels of difficulty, because we need increasing levels of resolution. It's if you want, it's like me drawing you a map. Okay, if you want to first of all, I can't draw worth crap, but in this hypothetical, let's assume I can. So if you want me to draw you a map of the United States, what level of resolution do you want? Is how hard is it going to be? So if you want me to just draw like an outline of the United States, not so hard. If you want me to start drawing state lines, hard. County lines, cities, blah, blah, blah. More levels of resolution is harder, right? Same kind of thing in law. So if you want a 95 to 99% level resolution, it's pretty easy. If you want to know exactly where the answer is, well, my friend, at that point you're asking, where's the edge of the cliff? And I don't know exactly, because in this hypothetical land, the cliff is covered with snow. So I can't see it exactly, neither can you. And if you want me to tell you exactly where it is, my recommendation is please don't get near the edge. I don't know where exactly it is. I know it's somewhere beyond this line. Please don't go past that line. You might be okay. Please don't. So yeah, you have to be careful with these things. Please don't dance on the edge of the volcano. Is my legal recommendation. It might not end well for you. Instagram's community guidelines state that Facebook removes content that contains credible threats and serious threats of harm to public safety that aren't allowed. Both sections include links to violent and incitement community standards. Did we actually get a link? Did we actually get a citation of the... If I follow this link, will it tell me what I want to know? Let's find out. I'm not going to adjust this, but let's see if it actually defines incitement anywhere. No. Okay, well, that was not helpful. Was the Boston Tea Party considered an unjust rioting? Oh, yeah. Absolutely. You know who agrees with that? The Founding Fathers. The Boston Tea Party was illegal. Yes. So was the American Revolution. It was illegal. Many, 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 many laws were broken during the American Revolution. This is not a controversial proposition. When you're going to violently overthrow the government, that's kind of illegal. So, was what we did legal? Hell no. But we won. So, So, yeah, I guess it's okay as long as you win. But, better be sure. Facebook community standards on violence and incitement states it removes content, disables account, and work with law enforcement that threatens public safety. Standard specifically prohibits. Okay, we read that. Let's go down. Facebook's terms of service state that Facebook may suspend or permanently disable access to an account if it determines that a user had clearly, seriously, or repeatedly breached its terms of policies. The introduction to the community standards notes that consequences for violating our community standards vary depending on the severity of the violation and the person's history on the platform. Instagram's terms of use state that Facebook can refuse to provide or stop providing all or part of the service to you, including terminating or disabling your access to Facebook's products and Facebook's company products, immediately to protect our community and services, or if you create risk or legal exposure for us, violate the terms of policy, including our Instagram community guidelines. Instagram's community guidelines states overstepping these boundaries may result in deleted content, disabled accounts, or restrictions. Okie doke. Facebook's values. So one will take note here that they referred to Instagram's definition of incitement, but didn't actually provide it, which is kind of annoying in a legal decision. Whatever this is, we're going to try to treat it like one. Facebook had 5 values outlined in the introduction of community standards, which it claims guide which is allowed. 3 of these values are voice, safety, and dignity. This doesn't sound like it's going to be amorphous in any way. Facebook describes voice as wanting people to be able to talk openly about the issues that matter to them, even if some may disagree or find them objectionable. Okay. Our commitment to expression is paramount, but we recognize the internet creates new and increased opportunities for abuse. I'm not sure about new, but increased I think is probably fair. Facebook describes safety as Facebook's commitment to make Facebook a safe place. In what sense of the word safe immediately comes to mind? And states that expression that threatens people has the potential to intimidate, exclude, or silence others isn't allowed on Facebook. Well, if you're actually threatening people in like a legal sense, that's illegal. You can't threaten people. That's a true threat. You can't do that. That's illegal. So if it's actually threatening people in a legal sense, then you could delete it because it's illegal. You can't threaten people. Somehow I don't think that's what they mean. Facebook describes dignity as its belief that all people are equal in dignity and rights, and states that it's best that people respect the dignity of others and not harass or degrade others. Harassing, yes. Degrading? What is degrading exactly? Harassing is, we can have some idea, but degrading is a little bit harder. Human rights standards. Okay, this will be fun. On March the 16th of 2021, which one will take immediate note, is after the date of the incident in question. So one could query about the inherent fairness of citing to a policy that didn't exist at the time as part of the decision. Now, this isn't criminal. So, if this were in civil court and Congress changed the law, civilly, you could do that. You can retroactively do civil because it's not ex post facto. Ex post facto is only criminal. So, but still, one could take question about the justice of this, but yeah. Anyways, on March 16, 2021, Facebook announced its corporate human rights policy, where commemorated its commitment to respecting rights in accordance with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which sounds Orwellian without me even reading it. The guidelines endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011 establish a voluntary framework for human rights responsibilities of private businesses. As a global corporation committed to this, Facebook must respect international human rights wherever it operates. Well, I take exception with the word must because they're voluntary. You only must do it insomuch as you're obligating yourselves. So, was it it was Immanuel Kant who said that the only rules that really exist are the ones that you apply to yourself. Something like that. Was that Kant? I'm pretty sure that was Kant. You have to give a rule to yourself. I think, yeah, that's Kant. Kant is pretty cool, although he's very indecipherable. I've tried reading the original in Kant. It's impossible. The Cliff Notes are much easier and more helpful, but I like Kant's thinking a lot. I need to reread that again. It's been a long time since I read that stuff. It's good stuff. Anywho, the board analyzed Facebook's human rights responsibility in the case by considering human rights standards, including the following: the right of freedom of expression, the right to life, the right to security of person, the right to non-discrimination, participation in public affairs, and the right to vote, the right to remedy. I don't know what any of this UN guidance is, and I'm skeptical. When Facebook refers a case to the board gives the person responsible for the content the opportunity to submit a statement. In this case, the statement to the board was submitted on behalf of Mr. Trump's behalf through the American Center for Law and Justice and a page administrator. It'd be interesting to read that. I'm not sure if they're going to give it to us. There was an opportunity for public comment before the board rendered its decision. I provided a link in the description below. It's 8,000 pages. So if you want to read 8,000 pages worth of public comment about whether or not banning Trump is good, knock yourself out. It's available. The statement requests that Byrd reverse the indefinite suspension account of the former U.S. president. The statement discusses the posts removed from Facebook and Instagram on January 6th, as well as Mr. Trump's speech earlier that day. It states the post called for those present at and around the Capitol that day to be peaceful and law-abiding and to respect the police. And it's inconceivable that either of these two posts can be viewed as a threat to public safety or an incitement to violence. In any sort of legal sense, yes. It also states that it is stunningly clear that in his speech there is no call for insurrection, no incitement to violence, and no threat to public safety in any manner. And describes a total absence of any serious linkage between the speech and the Capitol building incursion. The statements also discuss Facebook's reasons for imposing the restrictions. It states that nothing Mr. Trump said to the rally attendees could reasonably be interpreted as a threat to public safety. Yeah, particularly in light of what some other politicians have said, perhaps most notably politicians of the left who have said things that definitely sound much more like calls for violence, sometimes using those exact words. Mr. Trump's statements don't seem quite of that ilk. I like that Shaw 152. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Uncivil Law channel where we learn from the mistakes of Facebook. That's nice. I appreciate that. Thank you. The statement also discussed Facebook's reason for imposing the restriction. It states that nothing Mr. Trump said to the rally attendees could reasonably be interpreted as a threat to public safety. Facebook's basis for imposing restrictions cannot be safety related. It also states that any content suspected of impacting safety must have a direct and obvious link to actual risk of violence. The statement further describes the terms of fight or fighting used in the rally speech were linked to a call for lawful political and civic engagement, which seems quite credible, again, in light of many statements by many politicians using very similar verbiage, and concludes those words were neither intended nor were they believed by any reasonable observer or listener to be a call for violent insurrection or lawlessness. The statement also addresses the Capitol incursion. Capitol incursion. It states that all genuine Trump political supporters were law-abiding. I do not like this phraseology. You could have thought of a better way of phrasing this. Could you thought of a better way of phrasing this that doesn't immediately call to mind the no true Scotsman fallacy? You could have, thought about that better. No real Trump supporter was not law-abiding. And the incursion was certainly influenced and most probably ignited by outside forces. I'm not sure how we're defining outside in this context. It describes a federal complaint against members of the Oath Keepers and states the group was in no way associated with Mr. Trump or his political organization. Fair. It states that Oath Keepers were parasitically using the Trump rally and co-opting the issue of the electoral debate for their own purposes. Fair enough. The statement argues that Mr. Trump's rally speech did not violate the dangerous organizations and individual community standards because none of those categories fit the case. And Mr. Trump's political speech on January 6th never proclaimed a violent mission, a risk that lies at the very center of Facebook's policy. It also states that violence and incitement community standard fails to support suspension of the Trump Facebook account because the two posts merely call for peace and safety. And none of the words in Mr. Trump's speech, when considered in their true context, could reasonably be construed as incitement to violence or lawlessness. Seems pretty credible as an argument to me. That might go to my biases, one way or another, to be fair. And I might not be as fair if it were a person of the other opposition. So, it's always helpful to check one's biases and note that I'm interpreting this because, I'm conservative and, so maybe I'm not being completely fair to Trump or not being completely fair to the opposition, but we'll take note of the potential bias and move on, which is more than I can say for a lot of people, that they don't even take note of their own potential bias. It also cites Facebook referral to the board mentioning peaceful transfers of power and states that the new ad hoc rule on ensuring peaceful government transition is not just overly vague. It's non-existent until after the events Facebook used to justify it. Fair. The statement also argues the board should defer to American law on this appeal and discusses international law standards for restricting the rights of freedom of expression, of legality, legitimate aim, and necessary and proportionality, with each element interpreted by reference to United States constitutional law. On legality, the statement cites protection of hyperbole and false statements of fact, and Facebook's importance of the public discourse. That is legally protected. You can make false statements. Yes. It states that how employing content decisions based on what seems reasonable or how a reasonable person will react to content is not enough. And Facebook should consider a much higher bar, which seems totally fair if we're going by First Amendment principles. We need something perhaps a bit more than that. It states that the Supreme Court requires strict scrutiny for laws that burn political speech. True enough. And Facebook has market dominance. It also discusses constitutional standards for incitement to violence, which would be informed by the First Amendment, would be the constitutional standards, right? Incitement is necessarily at tension with the First Amendment because incitement is speech. The First Amendment is speech. So, you gotta make those notations carefully. Speech that is in, let me make sure I get this completely correct as I'm stating this because I don't want to get this wrong. Speech that is used in the commission of other crimes is not protected. Does that make sense? So you can't make a freedom of speech claim if the speech is inexorably tied to criminal activity. So, for example, if you're robbing a bank, you can't say, you can't say to your guy, go hold up the teller. That might be protected speech in some context. If you're doing a play about robbing a bank, but if you're actually robbing a bank, not so much, because it is core to the criminal conduct. So, no, you can't do that either. No First Amendment protection for you if the First Amendment, if your freedom of speech is being used in direct relation to a crime. No. On legitimate aim, it states that preserving public safety is a legitimate aim, but speech did not present public safety concerns. On necessity and proportionality, it denies the validity of restrictions and states the penalty was disproportionate. The statement concludes with suggestions that the board's policy recommendations on suspensions when the use is a political leader It argues the board should defer to legal principles of the nation state in which the leader is governing. I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea because some nation states, It then describes multiple exceptions to this deference based on assessments of rule of law, guarantees of rights, process of lawmaking, process of judicial review, and the existence of relevant legal principles. Sounds like a cogent argument, although we're not reading it directly, so whatever. For each case, Facebook provides an explanation of actions to the board, and the board asks Facebook questions to further clarify. It requires to make its decision. In the case, Facebook states it removed the 2 pieces of content posted on January 6th for violating dangerous individuals and organizations' community standards. Specifically, the content was removed for violating its policy prohibiting praise, support, and representation of designated violence events. Facebook also stated it contained a violation of dangerous individuals and organizations' policy prohibiting praise of individuals who engage in acts of organized violence, which again, The company notes its community standards clearly prohibit content that expresses support or praise for groups, leaders, or individuals involved in activities such as, I need to adjust that volume again. Activities such as terrorism, organized violence, or criminal activity, and that this activity includes organized assault as well as plans of active violence attempting to cause injury to a person with intent to intimidate the government in order to achieve a political aim. Which, is one of the definitions of terrorism. Facebook notes that its assessment reflected both the letter of the policy and surrounding context in which the statement was made, including the ongoing violence at the Capitol. It said while Mr. Trump did ask people in his video to go home in peace, he also reiterated allegations the election was fraudulent, which isn't any of the things that the policy seems to mention, and suggests the common purpose in saying, I know how you feel, which is a statement of empathy. Given the ongoing instability at the time of his comment and the overall tenor of his words, Facebook concludes that we love you, you're very special, was intended at praise of people who are breaking the law by storming the Capitol. That seems like a slightly strained conclusion in the light of the overall statement. We love you, you're special is intended as praise. In context, the context that overall was calling for peace and respect of law and order and not being like them and going home. That's a strange way to express praise, but okay. It also believes the second post contained praise of the event, as Mr. Trump refers to those who stormed the Capitol as great patriots and urge people to remember this day forever, as he's also calling them to do the peace. Facebook notes it regularly limits the function of Facebook pages and profiles and Instagram accounts, which repeatedly or severely violates its policies. Where it concludes that there is an urgent and safety risk, Facebook goes beyond its standard enforcement protocol to take stronger action against users and pages engaged in violent behavior. In such cases, Facebook states its enforcement actions remain grounded in the community standards and Instagram community guidelines. It states that it evaluates all available enforcement tools, including permanent bans, before deciding which is the most appropriate to employ in each unique circumstance, which is fair enough because justice should be individualized. In cases where Facebook must make an emergency decision as widespread interest endeavors to share its decision and reasoning with the public, often through a post in the newsroom. Facebook states that it does not usually block the ability of pages to post or interact with content, but removes pages which severely or repeatedly violate Facebook's policy. However, Facebook notes that its enforcement protocols for profiles, including feature blocks, may also be applied to Facebook pages when they're used in a person's singular voice, as with the Donald Trump page. In this case, Facebook states that in line with its community enforcement protocols, initially imposed a 24-hour block on the ability to post from the Facebook page and Instagram account. After further assessing, evaluating the situation and emerging details, Facebook concluded a 24-hour ban was not sufficient to address the risk that Trump would use his Facebook and Instagram presence to contribute to a further risk of violence, which is not immediately obvious how he was doing that given the things that he said. Also, one would take note that he didn't say them on Facebook as such. He said them off Facebook. So Facebook is also implicitly banning you for content that you didn't make off Facebook because he didn't He made those statements on Twitter, which, is not Facebook. Anyway, Facebook notes that maintained the indefinite suspension after Mr. Biden's inauguration party due to its analysis the violence connected to Mr. Trump had not yet passed. It cited the National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin by Department of Homeland Security that describes a heightened threat environment, which Department of Homeland Security believes will persist in the weeks following the election or inauguration, and may drive to violence will remain through early 2021 and may be emboldened, which is, again, in my humble opinion, a reasonable conclusion for the Department of Homeland Security to draw. It is a risk-adverse approach, which is perfectly reasonable for the Department of Homeland Security, being a little bit risk-adverse, right? Facebook notes that even when the violence had diminished, it may be appropriate to permanently block Mr. Trump's ability to post based on the seriousness of his violations. His continued insistence that the election was fraudulent, which is not a violation of the policies, at least the policies that we quoted. Insisting that the election is fraudulent is not a violation of the policy. It's not a call for violence or terrorism or anything else. It's I've been cheated. So, it's not the same thing. His sharing of other misinformation, which also I'd like to take note, also is not a violation of policy, and the fact he's no longer president. Which I don't know how it's material one way or another since you blocked him when he was president, but okay. Facebook states his decision was informed by Article 19 of some UN whatever on freedom of expression, which permits necessary and proportional restrictions on freedom of expression in situations of public emergency that threatens the life of a nation. I guess, but, if you're going to try that in U.S. law, you're going to need a big threat ban. Big one. Big boy. Big boy. And even then, we did learn something from the Schneck case dealing with fire in the crowded theater, right? In this case, D.C. was operating under a state of emergency, but declared to protect the U.S. Capitol complex. Fair. Facebook also notes it took into account 6 contextual factors from the Rabbit Plan of Action, which I have no idea what that is, on prohibition of advocacy of national, religious, or racial hatred, which is in contradiction to U.S. principles of freedom of expression, one would take note. The Rabat Plan of Action was developed by experts with support of the United Nations to guide states in addressing when advocacy of racial, religious, or national hatred that incites discrimination, hostility, or violence is so serious that resort to state-imposed criminal sanctions is appropriate, while protecting freedom of expression in line with the state's obligations. Given how some nations in our world have addressed this balance between hate speech and freedom of expression, I am not particularly encouraged by the United Nations guidance on this issue. I feel like in many instances, the restrictions on freedom of expression have been somewhat severe when it comes to any speech that seems to denigrate religion or race or anything else. And all I have to say to all that is thank God for the First Amendment. And may it long reign. Thank God for the First Amendment, man. Whatever you might think about U.S. First Amendment law, I think we're doing pretty good on a worldwide standard. So, that's my opinion. I think it's going pretty well here in the USA. Facebook argues that the events of January 6th represent an unprecedented threat to the democratic process and constitutional system of the United States. The events of the day do, sure. Fair enough. The events of the day, yes. But Donald Trump, specifically? Well, Facebook asserts that it strives to act proportionally and accountability in curtailing public speech. Given the unprecedented and volatile circumstances, Facebook believes it should retain operational flexibility to take further action, including a permanent ban. Okay. In this case, the board asked Facebook 46 questions, and Facebook declined to answer 7 entirely and 2 partially, which, apparently is an option in this court. Apparently, if this court asks you questions I don't want to answer is a viable thing. The questions Facebook did not answer include questions about how Facebook's newsfeed and other features impacted the visibility of Mr. Trump's contact, whether Facebook had researched or plans to research those design decisions in relation to January 6th, and information about violating content from followers of Mr. Trump's accounts. The board also asked questions relating to the suspension of other political figures and removals of other content which Facebook had been contacted by political office holders or their staff about suspension of Mr. Trump's accounts, and whether the account suspension or deletion impacts the ability of advertisers to target the accounts of followers. Facebook stated that this information was not reasonably required for decision-making in accordance with the intent of the charter, was not technically feasible to provide, was covered by attorney-client privilege, and or could or should not be provided because of legal, privacy, safety, or data protection concerns. Okay, well, apparently that's an option. Attorney-client privilege doesn't seem immediately obvious. Because it protects communications between the attorney and the client, but not the actions of the client. Those aren't communications. So, Third-party submissions. The Oversight Board received 9,666 public comments, to which I've provided you a link in the description below, so go nuts. 80 of those comments were submitted from Asian, Pacific, and Oceania, 7 from Central and South Asia, 136 from Europe, 23 from Latin America and the Caribbean, 13 from the Middle East and North Africa, 19 from Sub-Saharan Africa, and 9,388 from the United States and Canada. The submissions covered the following themes, which includes issues the board specifically asked about in its call for comments. Facebook's indefinite suspension of Mr. Trump's accounts, its possible compliance with the company's responsibility to respect freedom of expression and human rights, and if alternative measures should have been taken. Facebook's policies and practices of assessing off-Facebook content in enforcing its community standards. True that, right? True that. Issues involving the clarity of Facebook's rules for disabling content, Facebook's global content policies with respect to political candidates, office holders, and former office holders, including the relevance of Facebook's newsworthiness allowance and the right to public information. Concerns regarding the consistency in enforcement of Facebook's community standards based on political bias. Concerns about the enforcement of Facebook community standards with respect to Mr. Trump's previous posts, including those that may have contributed to harm towards certain groups of people and the spread of misinformation. Whether or not Mr. Trump's expression, both prior to and on the 6th, constitute incitement, which legally no. The outcome of the U.S. election and Trump's presidency. To read the comments, you can click on the link in my description below. Go nuts. The board agrees with Facebook's decision that the 2 posts by Mr. Trump on January the 6th violated Facebook's community standards and Instagram community guidelines. Facebook community standards on dangerous individuals and organizations says that users should not post content expressing support of or praise of groups, leaders, or individuals involved in violating events. Facebook designated the storming of the Capitol as a violating event, fair enough, and it notes it interprets violating events to include these violent events, which, fair enough. It is a violent event. It's a very illegal event. It's a dangerous event. It's a threat to public safety and all the rest of it. Not a lot of constitutional counter considerations for the actual storming of the Capitol. Not a lot of constitutional analysis we need on that one. At the time the posts were made, the violence at the Capitol was underway. Both posts expressed support or praise for people that were engaged in violence. The words "we love you, you're very special" in the first post, and "great portraits and remember this day forever" in the second post amounts to praise or support of the individuals involved in the violence and the events of the Capitol. Yeah, no. First of all, are we against expressions of love? I was told by the Beatles, love is all we need. So, there's that. But those words are being taken pretty directly out of context and is not really supporting praise. In fact, the overall tenor seems against that. So this strikes me as a strained interpretation. The board notes that other community standards may have been violated in this case, including the standard on violence and incitement. Because Facebook's decision was not based on the standard, an additional finding of violation would not affect the outcome. A majority of the board refrains from reaching any judgment on this alternative ground. Fair enough. It's judicial restraint. But they are suggesting it, which is not necessarily proper for a court to do. Really. The decision upholding Facebook's imposition of restrictions on Mr. Trump's account is based on the violation of dangerous individuals and organizations' community standard, which I'm having serious quibbles with right now. A majority of the board would consider the additional grounds and find that violence and incitement standard were violated. Oh, a minority. Apologies. A minority. Misread that. A minority would consider it and hold it was violated. The minority would hold that, read in context, the statements stating the election was stolen and so unceremoniously, viciously stripped, couples with praise of the rioters, qualifies as calls for actions. Avocation of violence and misinformation and unverifiable rumors that contribute to the risk of violence. I don't know about that one. The board finds these two posts severely violated Facebook's policies and concludes that Facebook was justified in restricting the account and page on January 6th and 7th. The user praised and supported people involved in a continuing riot where people died. Lawmakers were put at risk of serious harm and a key democratic process was disrupted. Well, 2 out of the 3 at least. Moreover, at the time when these restrictions were extended on January 7th. See, this is what annoys me, among other things. Like, we don't need to lie to make our point or exaggerate to make our point. This is what annoys me about the 5 people being died. 5 people died. The evidence just simply does not appear to support that at this time. The 1 person died from being shot by the police. That is very clear. And the 4 other people do not seem to be causally connected to the Capitol, as best as the information that has come out has so far revealed, unless I'm not aware of something. So if I'm wrong factually, then, I'm willing to admit if I'm wrong, but this is the information I have, that the other 4 people are not causally connected to the Capitol. So we don't need to lie. No one could have died, and we still would have been able to make the point. Because it was bad, even if no one died. Someone dying is not what made it bad. And someone dying is arguably not even the worst thing about it, depending on your point of view. I mean, you could make that point. I mean, someone dying is bad, obviously, but, the overall threat and rioting and violence of the day and the implied threat to democracy, the implied threat to the rule of law, you can make a credible case that someone dying isn't even the worst thing about the day. Particularly because the killing of that particular person appears to be legally justified, in my view. So, we don't need to lie to make the conclusion. And when you do lie, it kind of undermines your case because it makes you seem less credible. So, it's a little bit annoying. Moreover, at the time these restrictions were extended on the 7th, the situation was fluid, and serious safety concerns remain. Fair enough. Given these circumstances, restricting Trump's access to Facebook and Instagram past the 6th and 7th, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't flow. Struck an appropriate balance in light of the continuing risk of violence and disruption. As detailed more fully below, however, Facebook's decision to make these restrictions indefinite finds no support in community standards and violates the principles of freedom of expression. The board notes that there is limited detailed public information on the cross-check system and newsworthiness allowance. Although Facebook states the same rules apply to high-profile accounts and regular accounts, different processes may lead to different substantive outcomes. Facebook told the board it did not apply the newsworthiness allowance to the posts at issue in this case, which isn't the same thing Well, they couldn't have because they took them down. So obviously they didn't. Unfortunately, the lack of transparency regarding the decision-making process appears to contribute to perception the company may be unduly influenced by political or commercial considerations. The reason I say it's not the same thing is because earlier in the document, it read in such a way as to imply that Facebook said it never used the allowance, ever. And I was like, I don't know about that. And now they're saying, well, Facebook said it didn't use them in these 2 posts, which is not the same thing as what they said before. They obviously didn't use them in the 2 posts because they took them down. The newsworthiness allowance would allow the content to stay up. So the very fact that they don't stay up means the allowance didn't apply. So, yeah, it doesn't tell you anything you didn't know. And it's definitely not the same thing as we never applied the allowance with respect to Trump. Which isn't to say that that's bad if they did. It's just not the same thing. The analysis above is consistent with Facebook's values of voice and safety. Okay. For the reasons stated in this opinion, the case of protected public order justified limiting freedom of expression. Okay. I mean, maybe, depending on your view. In sort of the legal analysis world, right? So, if people are, if there's a riot ongoing and other people are also lawfully protesting, it is reasonable for the police to disperse the crowd and say there's now an unlawful assembly. So that can happen, right? Even if you're doing nothing wrong, if you're in the zone of people doing something wrong, it's reasonable for the police to fix the entire zone. And that can go even further than that, right? The police could, in a certain situation, order the evacuation of people in a particular zone in response to an ongoing police threat, even though it interferes with people's ability to stay in their home, for example. Or they could impose, restrictions that need to respond to an ongoing threat. Now, those are going to be temporarily limited, right? But that can happen. So depending on your point of view, if they are censoring him because even if he's lawfully speaking, it's part of some sort of correcting the zone, maybe, but they didn't do that. And also it wouldn't extend beyond the incident, which can't be the rationale, therefore, because the rioting was well over by the 7th. So, the U.S. Capitol was back in operation by the evening of the 6th. A minority believe it's important to emphasize dignity was also relevant. Facebook relates dignity to equality, and that people should not harass or degrade others. How did he harass or degrade anybody? The minority considers below that previous posts on the platform by Mr. Trump, which are not irrelevant in this case, might I add, contribute to racial tension and exclusion. And this context was key to understanding the impact of the content. Having dealt with this case on other grounds, the majority does not comment on these later posts because they're not an issue. The board's decisions do not concern human rights obligations of states or applicability of national laws, but focuses on Facebook content policies, its values, and human rights responsibilities as a business. Those human rights responsibilities have been self-imposed, though. So, the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, which Facebook has endorsed, establishes what businesses should do on a voluntary basis. Voluntary, though. This includes avoiding, causing, or contributing to human rights harm, in part through identifying possible and actual harms and working to prevent or address them. These responsibilities extend to harms caused by third parties. Facebook has become a virtually indispensable medium for political discourse. Questionable at this point in time. Facebook's influence is definitely on the wane compared to its former glory days, and especially so in election periods. It is a responsibility that both allows political expression and to avoid serious risks to other human rights. Facebook, like other digital platforms and media companies, has been heavily criticized for distributing misinformation and amplifying controversial and inflammatory material. That's in no way questionable. Facebook human rights responsibilities must be understood in light of these sometimes competing considerations. The board analyzes Facebook's human rights responsibilities through international standards of freedom of expression and rights to life, security, and political participation. International standards are not necessarily encouraging to me. Article 19 of some UN whatever sets out the freedom of expression. Article 19 states that everyone shall have a right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other medium of choice. The board does not adopt the First Amendment of the Constitution, which does not govern the conduct of private companies. True enough as to that. However, the board notes that in many relevant respects, the principles of freedom of expression reflected in the First Amendment are still similar or analogous to principles of freedom expressed in Article 19. You know what? As relates to Article 19 in isolation, I agree. The First Amendment and Article 19 sound very, very similar to my mind. Right? I recognize this language. I recognize this idea. It's like if you put this language next to me and you said, is this the same thing as the First Amendment? I'm like, yeah, basically. But then, of course, there's other provisions that kind of, take that away because of dignity and religion and, okay. Political speech receives high protection under human rights because of its important democratic debate. The UN Human Rights Committee provides authoritative guidance in General Comment number 34, in which it states that free communication of ideas about public and political issues between citizens, candidates, and elected representatives is essential. Now, I would take note that the word essential, by its own literal terms, means that you cannot do it without. That would be what something means to be essential. If you don't have it, you die. That's essential. So if it's truly essential for there to be free information about political commentary between candidates, and that's truly essential, but maybe it's not as essential as other things that are essential. I'm not 100% sure you know what essential means at this point, but okay. Facebook's decision to suspend Mr. Trump's Facebook page and Instagram account has freedom of expression implications, not only for Mr. Trump, but also for the rights of people to hear from leaders, whether they support them or not. That is actually a very cogent observation, and good on them for noting it. Because when you silence someone, you not only silence them, you silence everyone who wanted to listen to them. Freedom of speech is also the freedom to listen to those who are speaking. So very cogent and wise of them. When you prevent someone from speaking, you not only inhibit them, you inhibit everyone who wanted to listen. So good on them for noting that. They're going to ignore it, but good on them for noting it. Although political features do not have a greater right of freedom of expression than other people, which, actually seems to be contradicted by the very UN guidance you just stated earlier, because politicians are specifically noted as a group, which purportedly gives them some sort of specialized status. So, I don't know about that. Restricting their freedom of speech can harm the rights of other people to be informed and participate. However, international human rights standards expect state actors to condemn violence and provide accurate information to the public on matters of public interest while also correcting misinformation. I can think of some world leaders in the world right now, some very prominent ones, arguably some very powerful ones, who are not exactly condemning violence and are not necessarily free of all misinformation. I can think of some world leaders in the world right now who, if this was really the rule, international law allows for expression to be limited when certain conditions are met. Any restrictions must meet 3 requirements. The rules must be clear and accessible, they must be designated for a legitimate aim, and they must be necessary and proportional to the risk of harm. The board uses this 3-part test to analyze Facebook's actions when it restricts content or accounts. Facebook First Amendment principles under U.S. law also insists restrictions of freedom of speech imposed through state action may not be vague, must be for important governmental reasons. Actually, no, that's not the right word. You want the word isn't important. The word you want there is compelling. Compelling governmental reasons, not important. Compelling. This is not something where you can just substitute the word. The word is compelling. It must be narrowly tailored. That part is right. Important is not the right word. In international law on freedom of expression, the principle of legality requires any rule used to limit expression is clear and accessible. People must be able to understand what is allowed and what is not allowed. Equally important, rules must be sufficiently clear to provide guidance to those who make decisions on limiting expression, so the rules do not confer unfettered discretion, which can result in selective application. Should we criticize the degree to which we think the rules Facebook has are clear, accessible, clear on guidance? Do the Facebook rules confer unfettered discretion? Do they result in selective application? Are there any leaders in the world right now to whom these rules are not being applied? These policies aim to set out what people cannot post, and Facebook's policies on when it can restrict Facebook and Instagram account. The clarity of the standard against praise and support of dangerous individuals and organizations leaves much to be desired. Well, thanks for acknowledging that, as the board has noted in a private decision. We're still going to apply it, though. The UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression has also raised concerns about the vagueness of dangerous individuals and organization standard. The UN standards being vague? Whoa. As this board has noted previously in a case, there may be times in which certain warning may raise legality concerns, but as it applies to a particular case, those concerns are not warranted. I don't know about that. Any vagueness under the terms of standards not render its application circumstances doubtful. If it were truly vague in a legal sense, it would. That's a no-no. You can't have vague laws, especially First Amendment in particular. Vagueness, no. Now, what constitutes vagueness is not as much as some people think. Because again, as I noted earlier, I think in this very stream, some people want to know exactly where the line is, exactly, between criminal and non-criminal. They say, if I can't tell exactly where it is, the line is vague. And I'm like, no, that's not what we mean by vagueness. You need to get over yourself. But if it is actually vague in a legal sense, then the law can't stand, regardless of who we're applying it to. So, that doesn't flow. The January 6th riot at the Capitol felt squarely within these types of harmful events. Really? Squarely? Okay. And Mr. Trump's post and supported those involved at the very time violence was going on, and while members of Congress were calling for help. In relation to these facts, Facebook's policies give adequate notice to user and guidelines for enforcement. Jessica Chastain says, I missed Donald on social media. I was surprised they kicked him off. Mike Lindell said he could use frank speech, as useless as his pillows. Nice. In relation to these facts, Facebook's policies gave adequate notice to the user and guidance to those enforcing the rule. Really? Okay. With regard to penalties for violations, the community standards and related information about the account restrictions are published in various sources, including the terms of service, the introduction to community standards on account integrity and authentic identity, the Facebook newsroom, and the Facebook help center. As noted in a prior case, the board reiterates that the patchwork of applicability rules makes it difficult for users to understand why and when Facebook restricts accounts and raises legality concerns. So the board says there's a patchwork system of rules. These rules make it difficult for users to understand what the rules are, but they're nevertheless clear enough for this case. Some of the board's conclusions do not feel like they're adequately supported by the board's reasoning. Some of the board's reasoning and some of the board's conclusions, to my mind, seem in tension. The board says the rules can be vague. The board says there's a patchwork system of rules. The board says the patchwork system of rules makes it difficult for users to understand the rules. The board says that understanding the rules is really, really important. The board concludes that Donald Trump had clear notice. This conclusion strikes me at tension with the reasoning. While the board is satisfied that the dangerous individuals and organizational standard is sufficiently clear under the circumstances of this case, that I'm not 100% sure how that's possible. How can it be sufficiently clear in this case if it's vague in general? If it's vague, it's vague. It can't really say it's vague and sufficiently clear at the same time. This is a strange proposition. You want to say it's vague and sufficiently clear at the same time. I don't know, man. Maybe you're not using the word vague with the typical legal precision. Because the word vague, legally, right? If you're saying vague, you can't also say clear. Those not really Okay, but it's sufficiently clear somehow in the vagueness. It's sufficiently clear under the circumstances of this case to satisfy clarity and vagueness norms of freedom of speech. Facebook's imposition of an indefinite restriction is vague and uncertain. Indefinite restrictions are not described in the community standards, and it's unclear what standards would trigger this penalty or what standards will be employed to maintain or remove it. Facebook provided no information of any prior imposition of indefinite suspension in any other case. The board recognizes the necessity of some discretion on Facebook's part to suspend accounts in urgent situations like that of January, but users cannot be left in a state of uncertainty for an indefinite time. Okay. All right. The board rejects Facebook's request for it to endorse indefinite restrictions imposed and lifted without clear criteria. Clear criteria such as the clear criteria we referred to earlier as vague. Appropriate limits on discretionary powers are crucial to distinguish legitimate use of discretion from possible scenarios around the world in which Facebook may unduly silence speech not linked to harm or delay action critical to protecting people. The requirement of legitimate aim means that any measure restricting expression must be for a purpose limited in the UN Article 19, and this list of aims is exhaustive. Legitimate aims include, so we believe in freedom of speech as a paramount value except when protection of public order as well as respect for the rights of others, including the right to life, security, and participate in elections, and that outcome respected and implemented. An aim would not be legitimate where used as a pretext for suppressing expression. For example, to cite the aims of protecting security or the rights of others, to censor speech simply because it is disagreeable or offensive. Facebook's policy on praising and supporting individuals involving violent events, violence, or criminal activity was in accord with these aims. Okie doke. The requirement of necessity and proportionality means any restriction on expression must, among other things, be the least intrusive way to achieve a legitimate aim. Least restrictive means is intermediate scrutiny. Are we going intermediate scrutiny? We were talking about strict scrutiny earlier, and then we messed up what strict scrutiny is. What are we doing now? Are we intermediate scrutiny? I don't even know where we are legally. The board believes that where possible, Facebook should use the least restrictive measure. Are we intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny? And protect the rights of others before resorting to content removal and account restriction. At a minimum, this would mean developing effective mechanisms to avoid amplifying speech that poses risk of imminent violence, discrimination, or other lawless action where possible and proportionate rather than banning speech outright. Facebook stated to the board it considered Mr. Trump's repeated use of Facebook and other platforms to to undermine confidence in the integrity of the election, necessitating repeated application by Facebook of authoritative labels correcting the misinformation, representing an extraordinary abuse of the platform. Well, if you're putting labels on it and providing corrected information, isn't that like sufficient from your own point of view? The board sought clarification from Facebook about the extent to which the platform design decisions, including algorithms, policies, and procedures, and technical failures, amplified Mr. Trump's post after the election, and whether Facebook had conducted any internal analysis of whether such design decisions may have contributed to the event of January 6th. Facebook declined to answer these questions. This makes it difficult for the board to assess whether less severe measures taken earlier might have been sufficient to protect the rights of others. The crucial question is whether Facebook's decision to restrict access to Mr. Trump's account on January 6th and 7th were necessary and proportionate. That's not the critical question or the crucial question. You are misframing the question. The crucial question is not whether the decision to restrict access on the 6th and 7th is necessary and proportionate. The crucial question is an indefinite decision. Or perhaps the correct decision would be the decision to restrict access from January 6th up until today, because the ban is still in place. But limiting it to the 6th and 7th is a different question. This is the importance of framing in law and many other things. This is the importance of framing. Is it good? Is it okay for Facebook to restrict? It's also the importance of considering the facts that are relevant and those that are irrelevant. Because framing tells you the facts that are relevant and irrelevant. It helps you know how to filter it, right? So if you're asking the question, is it right for Facebook to restrict Trump on January 6th? That's one factual posture. If you're asking, is it right for Facebook to restrict Donald Trump on the 6th and 7th? That is a slightly different factual posture. If you're asking, is it right for Facebook to restrict Donald Trump from January 6th until at least today, that's yet a different factual posture. If you're asking the question, is it okay for them to restrict him indefinitely? That is yet a different factual posture. So when you are not clear in the question, when you ask bad questions, this is why question asking. This is why asking the right question might be the most important skill in law and the hardest. It's the most important and it's the hardest. Because the question you ask determines the framing. It determines what is and is not relevant. It determines the right level of inquiry. It determines the right place to ask the question. So I do not like at all how the board appears to be muddling the question. Because the crucial question isn't just the 6th and 7th. Because if the crucial question was the 6th and 7th, we might very well come up with a different analysis. Because there's different issues of fact. Right? We might very well reasonably, if we're doing this legally, we might very well reasonably say, these actions are legitimate in the case of the imminent necessity. We could do that again for a police action from the government. We've talked about it a little bit already. There's an ongoing riot. Can they clear out the entire area of the riot? Yes. Even if it imposes on people who are obeying lawfully? Yes. Secure the area, reset, for the moment. Sure. That needs to be temporarily limited. It can only last as long as it needs to last. That situation is going to be dynamic. Most of the time when this happens in the U.S., most of the time, they get it right. Sometimes they don't do enough, as we saw in the Chaz Chop, for example. They don't do enough to do this. So Seattle could, and in my view should, have used its police authority to clear out the Chaz Chop. That would have been legal, right? We have a 5-block radius that is currently under an imminent lawless action. Is it legal for the government to impose on everyone? Yep. Can they impose on it indefinitely? No. So if we're asking how long can Seattle do that, we'd ask different questions, right? So if we were analyzing, can Facebook do this on the 6th? Can they do it on the 6th and 7th? Can they do it for 3 months? Can they do it forever? Those are very different questions. So I do not like that they muddle the question. Because when you muddle the question, you muddle the understanding. Anyways, to understand the risk posed by the January 6th post, the board assessed Mr. Trump's Facebook and Instagram posts and off-platform comments since the November election, in maintaining an unfounded narrative of election fraud and persistent calls to action. But the calls to action he made were legal. Mr. Trump created an environment where serious risk of violence was possible. You know, if we're going to apply this standard universally, and by no means am I saying we should, because, again, I don't think it's the right standard, but I do think standards should be applied across the board, right? So, if we're going to say Mr. Trump did it bad, because even though what he was calling for, especially before the date of the incident, was lawful, you know, for people to assemble and people to speak up their voices and to fight for their rights right and stuff, if we're going to censor Mr. Trump for those statements, because those statements, while lawful unto themselves, somehow increase the risk of violence, and that's bad. If we're going to adopt that premise, can we talk about Antifa? Can we talk about BLM? Can we talk about that kind of stuff? You know, maybe what they're doing on its own terms is lawful, but, you know, there's an increased risk of violence that seems to have been demonstrated by past events at a bare minimum. So if we're going to apply this standard consistently, which I'm not saying we should, but if we are, maybe we should take down some BLM pages. Maybe we should take down some Antifa pages, because their speech, while calling for legal stuff, is nevertheless substantially increasing the risk of violence, as has been demonstrated by past events where that violence has in fact emerged. So it's not even speculative. So are we going to apply this standard consistently? Are we going to start taking down some BLM and Antifa pages now? Just wondering. Are we going to take down the pages of people organizing? Or are we going to take down the pages of people who are organizing protests outside of the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial? I mean, they were calling for purely legal things, right? We want people to assemble outside the courthouse and to protest about Black Lives Matter and Derek Chauvin. Did that pose an increased risk of violence? Are they responsible for that increased risk? Should we have taken down their pages? Should we take it down now? What is the standard again? What rule are we applying? Yeah. In maintaining an unfounded narrative of election fraud and persistent calls to action, he created an environment with serious risk of violence as possible. On January 6th, Mr. Trump's word of support to those involved legitimized their violent actions. I'd also like to bring on the reel of all the politicians saying things that also legitimized violent actions in much more express terms, in my view, and those politicians, to the best of my knowledge, have not been disciplined by Facebook. Although the message included a seemingly perfunctory call for people to ask peacefully. Really? There was multiple perfunctory calls. This was insufficient to diffuse tensions and remove the risk of harm that his supporting statements contributed to. It was appropriate for... Okay, I'm back. OBS crashed. Sorry for the delay. OBS crashed. So I'm not sure exactly where I was, but we'll pick up where I was anyway. So, good times. It was okay. As part of the analysis, the board drew up 6 factors from the Rabbit Plan of action to assess the capacity of speech to create a serious risk of inciting discrimination, violence, or other lawless action. In context, the posts were made during a time of high political tension centered on unfounded claim that the election had been stolen. High political tension. Can't think of any other events in memory where that might be applicable to. The Trump campaign raised these claims in courts with little or no evidence and they were consistently rejected. Mr. Trump nevertheless continued to assert these claims, including Facebook and Instagram, using his authoritative status as head of state to lend him credibility. He encouraged supporters to come to the nation's capital to stop the steal, suggesting the events would be wild. Wild doesn't mean illegal or violent. On January 6, Mr. Trump urged supporters to march to the Capitol, which is lawful, unless we're discouraging people from encouraging people to march. At the time of the post, severe violence was continuing. When the restrictions were extended on the 7th, the situation remained volatile. Among other indications and context, the District of Columbia took steps to warn of a heightened risk, which, again, might very well justify Facebook on the 6th and 7th, but that's a different question. Mr. Trump's identity as President of the United States and political leader gave his Facebook and Instagram posts a high degree of influence. The board notes that President Mr. Trump has credibility and authority with members of the public, which contributes to the events of the 6th. Mr. Trump's status of head of state with a high position of trust not only imbued his words with greater force and credibility, but also created a risk his followers would understand they could act with impunity. And I don't know how. The board is not in a position to conclusively assess Mr. Trump's intentions. The possibility of violence listed in Mr. Trump's statements was clear, and the board considered that he likely knew or should have known his communications would have posed a risk of legitimizing or encouraging violence. Okay. The two posts on the 6th praised and supported rioters, even though they called to go them home peacefully. That's strange. I support the rioters by telling them to engage peace. That's a strange way of showing support in my view. I support you, rioters, and my method of support is I want you to go home peacefully. I want you to support law and order. I don't want you to behave like they do. I want you to stop. That's a strange method of supporting an ongoing riot to me. You know, this strikes me as odd. You know, this would be, okay, or I'll just make it me. If I went into the middle of an ongoing riot, which sounds like a bad plan on its initiative, but if I went into the middle of an ongoing riot and I had a megaphone and I shouted into the megaphone, hey, everyone, let's be peaceful. Let's stop this violence. Let's behave better than this. We're better than this. I love you all. I appreciate you being here and everything, but please, let's stop. This is not us. I'm breaking the law now? By calling on our better, by going in the middle of a riot and calling on our better angels? I'm breaking the law? I don't think so, man. I'm not seeing that. I'm supporting the riot because I said I love them and I understood why they were here and I feel their pain. I gave them a note of understanding as I'm asking them to stop. And I'm breaking the law? I don't think so. You know, I don't think so. Will Clem says, you aren't their respected leader. You're just one guy in that example. Okay, fine. I am now their respected leader. And I go into the middle of the riot with a megaphone and I say, hey, everyone, we are better than this. We should stop the violence. We should behave peacefully. Let's believe in law and order. I love you all. I understand your pain. I understand it, but this is not us. We are better than this. We need to stop with the rioting. Please go home in peace. I'm breaking the law? Now, I might have been breaking the law in some other way prior to this moment, right? So I'm not saying that I didn't do something criminal prior to this moment. Maybe I have. But if I go into the middle of the crowd of the ongoing riot and I say, hey, everyone, as your leader, peace, stop with the violence, let's all go home. We're better than this. I love you all. I'm committing a crime in that moment by what I'm saying? I don't think so. In fact, assuming that I am guilty of any other crimes, assuming I am guilty of any other crimes, I guarantee you my lawyer will be making strong notes of this as evidence of mitigation in whatever sentencing will come in the future. This would be mitigating. Like, I might have done some bad stuff, but I'm trying to undo the bad stuff. That's what we call mitigation. That's a good thing. It makes you less responsible. You might still be responsible, but it makes you less responsible. Mitigation is good. We like it when criminals mitigate. We'd prefer they not be criminals in the first place, but if they're going to be criminals in the first place, we appreciate when they do mitigate. So, yeah. Not only is it not illegal, it is a good thing. And my lawyer will note it as a good thing. And the judge may very well note it as a good thing, and I might get some credit for it. We like it when people mitigate. Mitigation is good. Mr. Trump has a large audience, with a following of at least 35 million accounts on Facebook and 24 million accounts on Instagram. Importantly, these social media posts are frequently picked up and shared more broadly through mass media channels, as well as by high-profile supporters of Mr. Trump, with large audiences greatly increasing their reach. These posts were made during a dynamic and fluid period of ongoing violence. There was clear imminent risk of harm to life, electoral integrity, and political participation. The violence at the Capitol started within an hour of the rally organized through the use of Facebook and other social media. So that shows a temporal relationship, but the causal connection? You showed a temporal relationship, but a causal connection. He said march to the Capitol. He said protest. If we're going to hold Trump responsible for that because there was an increased risk of violence, then presumably we're going to take down anyone's post for any protest or march because, hey, increased risk of violence, right? Tensions are high. Usually when there's a march on something, usually tensions are a little high. Just saying. Normally, if there's a plan to march on the Capitol, normally tensions are in the air is somewhat implied. So are we taking down the posts of all marches now? Is that a thing that's happening? The riot directly interfered with Congress's ability to discharge its responsibilities, delaying the process by several hours. There's some major noise outside. Okay. Carrying on. Analyzing these factors, the board concludes the violation of the case was severe in terms of its human rights harms. Facebook's imposition of account-level restrictions on January 6th and extensions of these restrictions on the 7th was necessary and proportionate. Yeah, Will Clem says he also said fight like hell. He said fight like hell at the rally. Yes, and as has been noted by many others, including during the impeachment thing, many politicians have said fight like hell, if not stronger. So that seems to be including in somewhat imminent situations. Remember what Maxine Waters was saying about we need to take more aggressive action if we don't get the verdict we want, and George Floyd and stuff? I mean, there's plenty of examples across the board. So has Maxine Waters' Facebook page been disabled? Good guess no. For a minority of the board, while a suspension of extended duration or permanent disablement could be justified on the basis of the 6th alone, the proportionate analysis should also be informed by the use of Facebook platform prior to the election. Which is fair enough, because this would also work in criminal sentencing. When you're being sentenced, right? You're being sentenced within a range, right? So we can take note of other things, both for and against you, in determining the proper sentence for you. So if you're, done lots of other bad stuff, we can take note of that as we're determining a proper sentence for you. If you've done good stuff, we can take notice of that. So yeah, in determining the right sentence for the crime, assuming there's a crime, which I have problems with for the reasons I've described, then yes, it would be proper to do this. Yeah. In particular, the minority note that the May 28th, 2020 post says that when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which is well before the Capitol riots, so strange somewhat to tie it in. as well, and made in context of protests for racial justice. Wow. Wow. That's an interesting framing, isn't it? The minority notes in a May 28th, 2020 post, Trump said when the looting starts, the shooting starts, made in the context of protests for racial justice. Interesting word choice you went with there. Protests for racial justice. Interesting. So Trump made his comments on the 6th in the context of protests relating to the election. That's bad. Protests for racial justice is good. Also, by protests we mean burning, looting, and pillaging. I'm feeling like we may have a bit of a cognitive dissonance on here. We're not completely applying our standards consistently in the context of protests for racial justice. Also, which occurred during COVID restrictions, which also was bad, I'd like to take note. Right? Because mass gatherings as well as multiple references regarding the China virus. Describing a virus by its geographic locality is not new. See West Nile virus. See, See lots of other names. Yeah. Facebook made commitments to respect the right to non-discrimination and in line with requirements for restrictions on the right of freedom of speech, to prevent the use of a platform for advocacy of racial or national hatred constituting incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence. Okay. The frequency, quantity, and extent of the harmful communication should inform the rabbit incitement analysis. I'm not sure why Rabbit or Rabat or whatever his name here became the end-all be-all of authority on this, but okay. In particular, the factors on context and intent. For the minorities, broader analysis will be crucial to inform Facebook's assessment of proportionality penalty on the 7th, which serves both as a deterrent to our political leaders and, where appropriate, an opportunity for rehabilitation. Further, if Facebook opted to impose a time-limited suspension, the risk analysis required prior to reinstatement should also take into account these factors. Having dealt with the case on other grounds, the majority does not comment on this. Okie doke. He also implied China did it on purpose. I don't know if he implied that China did the virus itself on purpose, but he definitely implied that China took actions that helped facilitate the spread of the virus, which I think is a fair thing to say. China, lest we forget, in the very early days of the virus, suppressed any knowledge or discussion of it and put one doctor at least under house arrest, as memory serves. Maybe I'm conflating two different things, but if memory serves correctly, I believe in the very early days of the virus, one of the people who was saying, hey, there's a virus, I believe was put under house arrest to the degree he was welded inside of his house. Am I making this up? Or am I conflating more than one thing? But that sounds right. So yeah, China took some steps that were not helpful in the world learning about the virus earlier on. And, when you're talking about something that spreads and spreads in a somewhat exponential fashion, days matter. So if China had been honest earlier, would it have made a difference? Quite probably. Or, it would have, that time was probably important. So did China do things deliberately that facilitated the spread of the virus? That's a fair thing to conclude. Also, incidentally, and this is becoming a little bit more accepted of an idea these days than it was originally, but the idea that it escaped from a lab is also more accepted these days. This theory is no longer quite the poo-poo thing it once was. Remember when everyone said that it's insane? I'm like, I don't think it was insane. I never thought it was insane. It's like, it could go either way. I didn't think it was necessarily conclusory, but it's like, okay, this escaped from a lab. Makes sense. That could be. And now that's becoming more dominant. So maybe they screwed up there too, not taking the precautions of the lapses sufficiently seriously. Could be. You know. You're right, and he died, yeah. See, it's nice when you have a decent memory. On January 6th, Facebook's decision to impose restriction on the account was justified. Okay. The post in question violates rules of Facebook and Instagram that prohibit support or praise, including the riot that was underway. Given the seriousness of violations, Facebook was justified in imposing restrictions and extending the stay for the 7th. Okay. However, it's not appropriate to impose an indefinite suspension. Notice unanswered whether it was okay from January 8th on forward, which are different questions, which the board is in no way going to answer. The board is not going to answer that it was excessive at some point, right? And not even going to say it was excessive at some point, even if they can't define it, which is something we can do in law, right? So we did this, for example, in the Derek Chauvin trial, right? We were able to conclude, or at least I was able to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt, that Derek Chauvin had the requisite intent and was outside of his legal justification. And I think the evidence does not support a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that he had the intent or he was outside his authority at the start. So I do not think the evidence supports the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that he had the requisite intent or he was beyond his authority at the start. I do think that the evidence supports the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that at some point he had the intent and at some point exceeded his authority. Do I necessarily need to be able to identify the exact moment that occurred in order for me to reach that conclusion? No, I don't. I don't need to be able to say, well, it was exactly this second or exactly this action, or exactly this thing was the one straw too many. I don't need to tell you it was the one straw too many to tell you there are 8,000 too many straws. Which one, which one was too much? I don't know. I don't have to slice it that precisely, fortunately enough. If you make me pick a moment, I would say at least at the point that they stopped feeling a pulse would be it. At least at the point where he said, I can't feel a pulse. And then he went on for another 3 minutes. At least at that point. Does that mean that it didn't happen before that point? No. Am I saying it didn't happen before that point? No, but I know it happened at least that point. Maybe before, but I don't have to answer the question that precisely. So Facebook board could presumably do the same thing. They can say, it was okay on the 6th, it was okay on the 7th, it wasn't okay the entire time, without necessarily saying when exactly it stopped becoming okay. It's like, I know I crossed the line at some point without knowing exactly when. Yeah. So, but do they do that? No, they don't do that. They don't say, they say it's okay on the 6th, a reasonable conclusion. In the state of the emergency, reasonable conclusion. They say it's okay on the 8th in light of the emergency, reasonable conclusion. Is it necessarily valid up to today? They don't answer that question. Did it stop becoming valid at some point? They don't answer that question. They don't want to confront that analysis. They don't want to say, well, it was okay then, it was okay. It would be the equivalent of saying, well, Derek Chauvin was in the right at minute 1, and he was in the right at minute 2. And we need to ask no further questions beyond that. That does not please my legal mind. However, it was not appropriate for Facebook to impose an indefinite suspension. Facebook did not follow a clearly published procedure in this case. That implies they have a clearly published procedure, which I'd like to take note of. The board themselves say Facebook doesn't have. The board was quite clear earlier that not only do they not have a clearly published procedure, they have a lot of not so clearly published procedures in some sort of patchwork nightmare that leads to a vague thing that people can't understand, which is nevertheless okay and clear in this case somehow. Facebook's normal account level penalties for violations of its rules are either to impose a time limit suspension or permanently disable. The board finds it's not permissible to keep a user off platform for an undefined period with no criteria of whether or when it will be restored. So you could have banned them forever, but this indefinite suspension thing isn't any good, which one will take note implies that Facebook could decide to ban indefinitely as a result. Facebook doesn't necessarily have to make any decision right now. Apparently, Facebook is bound to report back in 6 months, I think, if memory serves from earlier in the document. So Facebook has to decide sometime in the 6 months, presumably, if they're going to reverse the ban or ban them forever. It's Facebook's role to create and communicate necessary and proportional penalties that applies in response to severe violations. The board's role is to ensure Facebook's rules and processes are consistent with its policies, its values, and commitment to human rights. In applying an indeterminate and standardless penalty and then referring this case to the board to resolve, Facebook seeks to avoid responsibility. I don't know if that's quite right, because presumably Facebook didn't have to refer to the board. If they wanted to avoid responsibility, they could have not done that. The board declines Facebook request and insists Facebook apply a justified, defined penalty. Facebook must, within 6 months, re-examine the arbitrary penalty it imposed and decide the appropriate penalty. The penalty must be based on the gravity of the violation and prospect for future harm. It must also be consistent with Facebook rules for severe violation, which in turn must be clear, which they're not. We established that earlier. Necessary and proportionate. If Facebook determines that Mr. Trump's accounts should be restored, which implies the opposite is possible, Facebook should apply its rules to that decision, including any modifications pursued to policy recommendations. Also, if Facebook determines to return him to the platform, it must address any further violations promptly in accordance with established content policies. So, presumably, the board has no problem if you decide to ban him. We just have a problem with the indefinite suspension, which is fair enough. I don't object to that part of it. I don't, because I do think that there is a material difference between a ban and an indefinite suspension. It's a sort of Damocles thing. So I think the board is right that, you can suspend them for a temporal period or ban them indefinitely, but you can't suspend them indefinitely. That's not within your bounds. I think that's fair. That's a fair conclusion. So, I'll give the board credit for when it gets things right. A minority believes it's important to outline some minimum criteria that reflect the board assessment of Facebook human rights responsibility. The majority instead provides guidance as to policy recommendations. The minority explicitly notes that Facebook's responsibility to respect human rights include facilitating remediation of adverse human right impacts it's contributed to. Remedy is a functional component. To fulfill its responsibility to guarantee adverse impacts are not repeated, Facebook must assess whether reinstating Mr. Trump's account would pose a serious risk of inciting imminent discrimination, violence, or other lawless action. This assessment of risk should be based on the considerations the board detailed in analysis of necessity and proportionality, including context of conditions on and off Facebook and Instagram, which apparently we have no problem with. Facebook should, for example, be satisfied that Mr. Trump has ceased making unfounded claims about election fraud. So that would be a no. Don't let him back on. In the manner that justified suspension on the 6th, Facebook enforcement procedures aim to be rehabilitative, and the minority believes this aim accords well with the principles of satisfaction in human rights law. A minority of the board emphasized that Facebook's rules should ensure that users who seek reinstatement after suspension recognize their wrongdoing, good luck, and commit to observing the rules in the future, good luck with that as well. In this case, the minority suggests that before Mr. Trump's account be restored, Facebook must also aim to ensure withdrawal of praise or support for those involved in the riots. The board acknowledges the difficult issues raised by this case and is grateful for the many thoughtful and engaged public comments it received. In referral of this matter to the board, Facebook specifically requested observations or recommendations from the board about suspensions when the user is a political leader. The board asked Facebook to clarify their understanding of the term political leader. Facebook explained that they sought to cover elected or appointed government officials and people who are actively running for office in an upcoming election, including a short period of time after the election if a candidate is not elected, but are not state actors. But not all state actors. Okay, so that would presumably not necessarily include Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example. Based on the board's analysis, it confines its guidance to issues of public safety. The board believes that it's not always useful to draw firm distinctions between political leaders and other influential users. It is if you consider political speech as such to be a paramount consideration, because presumably political leaders are speaking predominantly with political speech. It's important to recognize that other users with large audiences can also contribute serious risk of harm. That's true. The same rule should apply to all users. But context matters when assessing issues of causality. Context matters when assessing issues of causality. Really? Because not so sure about the causality on this one. And the probability and imminence of harm. What's important is the degree of influence a user has other users. I don't know if that's a reasonable conclusion or not. I have to think about it. I mean, presumably the more influence they have, the more damage they can do, but the policies are also supposed to apply to everyone evenly. So, I'm not so sure about that one. When posts by influential users pose a high probability of imminent harm as assessed under international human rights standards, Facebook should take action to enforce its rules quickly. Facebook must assess posts by influential users in context according to the way they are likely to be understood, even if their message is couched in language designed to avoid responsibility, such as superficial encouragement to act peacefully or lawfully. They describe it as superficial. What was the word they used earlier? They described it as platitudes or something like that. They're not a big fan of what Trump said, even though he said way more of be peaceful than the we love you thing, where love is bad apparently, or something. Facebook used all 6 contextual factors in the rabbit plan of action in this case, and the board thinks a useful way is to assess the contextual risk of potential harmful speech. The board stresses that time is of the essence in such situations. Taking action before influential users can cause significant harm should take priority over newsworthiness and other values of political communication, which sounds suspiciously like a call to censor first, ask questions later. So we value free speech and we value free expression, but it should not take priority over, these other things. So you need to act imminently and worry about the rest later. Ask for the apology later. Sounds suspiciously to me like act precipitously, apologize later. I'm not necessarily saying that that's bad, incidentally, because Facebook, of course, is a private organization. I'm just simply noting what they're saying between the lines. Right? I'm reading it and analyzing it and trying to describe what it says without necessarily indicating approval or disapproval, except where it's explicit, because I note contradictions or something, and logical fails, and thought fails, and inconsistencies. But yeah, I mean, is it a good thing for Facebook to act precipitously? Is it good for them to act first to ensure do no harm as a principal value, even over free expression? Don't know. Don't have a strong opinion on that right this second, because Facebook is a private organization. So there's balancing there that they can do that the government doesn't have to do. So, although I wish Facebook was a lot clearer in its policies, I wish it was a lot more honest about its policies. That's for sure. I wish they were, in fact, clear, which the board says they're not, and not a vague nightmare that nevertheless applied to me in a clear way. Heads of state and other high government officials can have greater power to cause harm than other people. Yes, they can, including by putting certain parts of their population into camps. Facebook should recognize that posts of heads of state and other high officials can carry a heightened risk of encouraging, legitimizing, or inciting violence, either because their high position of trust imbues their words with greater force or credibility, or because their followers may infer they can act with impunity. At the same time, it's important to protect the rights of people to hear political speech. Nonetheless, if a head of state or high government official has repeatedly posted messages that pose a risk of harm under international human rights norm, Facebook should suspend the account for a determinate period sufficient to protect against the harm. Periods of suspension should be long enough to deter misconduct and may, in appropriate cases, include account or page deletion. Hey, how are you doing, Kimberly? Nice to have you here. How are you doing today, Kimberly? Nice to have you here. Sup, girl. Restrictions on speech are often imposed by or at the behest of powerful state actors against dissenting voices and members of political oppositions. Restrictions on speech are often used against dissenting voices and political opposition. Restrictions on speech are often used against dissenting voices and political opposition. You don't want to think about that one with a little bit more care and thought? Facebook must resist pressure from governments to silence opposition. When assessing risk, Facebook should be particularly careful to consider relevant political context in evaluating political speech from highly influential users. Facebook should rapidly escalate, act precipitously, the content moderation process to specialized staff who are familiar with linguistic and political context and insulated from political and economic interference and undue influence. Good luck. The analysis should examine the conduct of highly influential users off Facebook and Instagram platforms adequately assess the full context of potentially harmful speech. Not for nothing, but if you're truly interested, Facebook, if you're truly interested in making sure that people are free of political influence, then you might do well to see that the people that are evaluating this are sufficiently diverse in terms of political opinion, right? If you want to make sure that this speech is not being censored for political reasons, you might want to make sure that the boards you comprise of are sufficiently representative of the various political opinions and do not dominantly lean with one political ideology or view. Just a suggestion. This analysis should examine the conduct of highly influential users off the Facebook and Instagram platforms. Oh, okay. I still don't know about the off Facebook and Instagram platforms. Yeah, I don't know about because Facebook used to be called the Facebook in the long, long ago in the far, far away. So I'm not so sure about that phraseology. I'd avoid it. To accurately assess the full context. Further, Facebook should ensure that it dedicates adequate resources and expertise to assess risk of harm from influential accounts globally. Oh, by the way, Kimberly, I think you had expressed interest in this before. So that's why I'm mentioning it. And I'll mention it to anyone else who happens to be watching as well now, too. I want to try again to get back into the true crime thing because I think it's an interesting thing and would be an interesting area to explore. But I literally don't know how to present it. So I need some help workshopping ideas. I need suggestions on different ways that it could be presented that would be appealing to the right audience. I want to make sure that it's going to work for the audience. And I don't have a good mental conception of a place to start. So if you are interested, Kimberly, in helping me, I essentially need some ideas of treatment, what you might call treatment in terms of like script. I need something that would give me the framework or frameworks that would help us to develop the right scaffolding from which to build stuff. So if you want to help, if anyone wants to help me on Discord, contact me on Discord and provide me some sort of ideas on like how to present it. How should it be presented? How would I actually go about the mechanism of it? Because I don't feel like a true crime story should be presented the same way I do a legal analysis story. I'm not sure that really works. So I need to figure out something else, and I don't know what that is yet. So if anyone has any ideas, contact me on Discord. Because I have no idea how I would present a true crime story in a way that would be of interest to my audience. I think it's an interesting topic, but I need help in figuring out how to present. I need a director, basically. I need a director. Help me figure out how to do this. That's what I basically need at this point. Facebook should publicly explain the rules it uses when it imposes account-level sanctions against influential users. The rules should ensure when Facebook imposes a time-limited suspension on the account of an influential user To reduce the risk of significant harm, it assesses whether the risk has receded before the suspension term expires. If Facebook identifies users poses a serious risk of inciting imminent violence, which, again, we can very strongly quibble with the word imminent here, discrimination or other lawless action at that time, another time-bound suspension should be imposed when such measures are necessary to protect public safety and proportionate to the risk. Gumi says, don't scare me with those eyes, Uncivil. I literally just clicked on your stream. Well, Gumi, how you doing? Don't want to scare you with these eyes. Just want to look at you with all the respect that you deserve. How you doing? What's up, everybody? Let's see. When Facebook implements special procedures that apply to influential users, these should be well documented. It was unclear whether Facebook applied different standards in this case, and the board heard many concerns about potential application of the newsworthiness allowance. It is important that Facebook addresses this lack of transparency and confusion that it has caused. Facebook should produce more information to help users understand and evaluate the process and criteria for applying the newsworthiness allowance. Facebook should clearly explain how the newsworthiness allowance applies to influential accounts, including political leaders and other public figures. In regarding cross-check review, Facebook should clearly explain the rationale, standards, and process of review, including criteria to determine which pages and accounts are selected for inclusion. Facebook should report on the relative error rates and thematic consistency of determinations made. Now, that would be nice. That would be nice if they actually reported on error rates and thematic consistency. That'd be nice. Through a check with ordinary enforcement procedures. That'd be nice. I think people would like that. If they do anything resembling that, that would be good. When Facebook's platform has been abused by influential users in a way that results in serious adverse right impacts, it should conduct a thorough investigation into the incident. Facebook should assess what influence it had and assesses what changes it could enact to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse impact in the future, which is always a good thing to do. Right? You should always say, like, what can we learn from this? That's always good. In relation to this case, Facebook should undertake a comprehensive review of its potential contribution to the narrative of election fraud and the exacerbated tensions that culminated in violence on January the 6th. This should be an open reflection on design and policy choices that Facebook has made that may enable its platform to be abused. Facebook should carry out this due diligence, implement a plan, and communicate openly about how adverse the plans it was involved with. You know, I can't help reaching the determination. And please let me know if you think I'm reading too much or reading too much between the lines. But I can't help get the very strong feeling the advisory board is essentially saying, you know, you might want to look at conservative speech writ large, or, you know, right-wing speech, or because of all that misinformation and human rights and stuff and the adverse stuff. You should look at the way that your platform is being abused by these people who want to mislead and confuse. You know, because of human rights. Can't help feel like there's some sentiment here that suggests they're not maybe looking for Facebook to continue being the open expression platform that they were calling for earlier, when they noted it was super duper important for expression to be heard. I'm sensing some comments between the line that may suggest the opposite. Maybe it's just me. In cases where Facebook or Instagram users may have engaged in atrocious crimes or grave human rights violations, we're not at all suggesting that might be true of any particular instance right now, are we? In cases, hypothetical cases, I'm sure, where Facebook users may have engaged in atrocious crimes or grave human rights violations, purely hypothetical, as well as incitement under Article 20 of UN whatever. The removal of account and disabling of accounts, while potentially reducing the risk of harm, may also undermine accountability efforts, including by removing evidence. Facebook has a responsibility to collect, preserve, and where appropriate, share information to assist in the investigation and potential prosecution of grave violation of international crime, human rights, and humanitarian law by competent authorities and accountability mechanisms. Facebook's corporate human rights policy should make clear the protocol the company has in place in this regard. The policy should make clear how information previously public on the platform can be made available to researchers conducting investigations that conform with international standards and applicable data protection law. The case highlights further deficiency in Facebook policies that should address. In particular, the board finds that Facebook's penalty system is not sufficiently clear to users and does not provide adequate guidance to regulate Facebook's exercise of discretion. Facebook should explain its community standards and guidelines in strikes and penalties process for restricting profiles, pages, groups, and accounts on Facebook and Instagram in a clear, comprehensive, and accessible manner. These policies should provide users with sufficient information to understand when strikes are imposed, including any applicable exceptions, or allowances, and how penalties are calculated. Facebook should also provide users with accessible information on how many violations, strikes, and penalties have been assessed against them, as well as the consequences that will follow future violations. In transparency reporting, Facebook should include numbers of profile, page, and account restrictions, including the reason and manner in which enforcement action was taken, with information broken down by region and country. Finally, the board urges Facebook to develop and publish a policy that governs its responses to crisis or novel situations when its regular process would not prevent imminent harm. We need some sort of emergency escape valve. That's not going to be abused in any way. While these situations cannot always be anticipated, Facebook's guidance should set appropriate parameters for such actions, including a requirement to review its decision within fixed time. And there's a procedural note that oversight board's decisions are prepared by panels of 5 members and approved by a majority of the board. Board decisions do not necessarily reflect personal views of all of its members. So, and then I like this here. Date published is May 5th. And then it says countries affected, United States. That's not in any way a misstatement, right? Because we were talking a lot in this document about international standards, international human rights, UN standards, UN rights. I remember a lot of these related words in this document, as I'm sure you do. UN, international, it appeared a lot. International human rights, it appeared a lot. So I'm sure that countries affected, United States, in no way suggests this only applies to the U.S. Because, I mean, that wouldn't make any sense because these are international standards, UN standards, international human rights. So I'm sure countries affected in no way implies that this should only govern what happens in the United States on Facebook, and in no way suggests this doesn't apply elsewhere in the world, which of course would be ridiculous because these are international standards and UN standards, as we were informed reliably many, many times. So I'm sure countries affecting the United States doesn't mean what it would seem to mean on its surface. I'm sure that this is merely a linguistic misstatement, and they don't mean that this policy should be limited to the United States, and they certainly mean their international UN guidance should apply around the world, don't they? To other countries and other leaders. That's what they mean, right? Okay. So that's a thing that happened. So, good times. So we've been streaming for 45 minutes. It felt a lot longer than that, to be honest. I'm not sure why, but it did. It felt a lot longer than the 45 minutes we've been streaming. Maybe because it hurt my brain more than normal. Yeah, that's probably true. Because we do like 2-3 hour Supreme Court stuff. And normally I can do it without hurting my brain this much. Because normally there's not that much logical inconsistency and problems. So normally I don't have to work this mentally hard. So this was a hard 45 minutes for Uncivil Law. I'm just saying. For what it's worth. If you're enjoying this legal education content, not necessarily what we're discussing in particular, because I'm not saying that you have to enjoy Facebook's thing. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But if you enjoy legal education content, which this is going to comprise as for the purposes of this exercise, please remember to like the video. Please like the video. If you haven't already, you should subscribe to the channel. There's a subscribe button. And did you know for 99 cents, you too can become a paid member of the channel? It's true. You will get a nice little icon next to your name, like A. Henninger and Kimberly have. See how they have a cool little scale next to their name? We went through several iterations of that scale, by the way, before we found the right one. We kept working on to make sure we got it right. See, Kimberly has a cool icon. Zulu has a cool icon. A. Henninger has a cool icon. And you can have a cool icon too by becoming a paid member of the channel. There's a link that comes up periodically that you can click if you're on iOS. And if you're not on iOS or you're down your desktop or whatever, you can click the join button. And for a mere 99 cents, which is the least I'm allowed to charge you, 99 cents a month, you can get a cool icon and help support the channel financially. See, that would be cool. So that you can do that. You can get that cool icon. You just click the link that the bot gives you and you're there, man. So Will Clem says, name a case you want to cover as an example for true crime. I don't know. I don't even know the case I want to cover. I got nothing. I don't know. I just know that there's a market out there. There's a market out there. It sounds like an interesting topic. So I don't even know what to discuss or how to discuss it, but I think I can discuss it. I think it's something I'm capable of doing. I just don't know how. So yeah, I need a producer. I need a producer and a director. I need a producer to help me with the selection of stories and the director to tell me how to do it. And, I need some help. So thank you, Kimberly, Roddy Mom, for the $1.99 super chat. It's supported. What kind of cases? I don't know. True crime cases. I don't know. Pick a case. All right, let's just set the parameters. All right, I would like the case that is going to get the most viewers possible and hopefully the most subscribers possible. That is my objective in this exercise. So I like the case that is going to be of most interest to the most people, and they will view it, and then they will subscribe to my content. I would like to drive my subscriber count. I like to increase my subscriber count. So what story do I want to cover? The one that will most assist in that objective. So what do you think people will be most interested in? What do you think people will be most want to see? What preferably stories that are hot in the news right now or getting lots of views right now? That'd be great. What content, if I covered it, would get me 5,000 live viewers? How about that? Because so many people want to watch the story right now and would get me subscribers. I don't know what that is. I don't know. I don't have enough knowledge in the relevant market. I know there's a market there, so someone else can help me figure out what that is. If you know, let me know. Yeah, serial killer or whatever. I don't, whatever. Do I want to do patents? No. No, patents or patients? Patents? Patent is not true crime. What true crime is there involving patents? I don't know. Probably. Yeah. Anyways, I'm going to sign off for now. Please like the video, subscribe, join, all the rest of it. Till later, as I think. Cheers and goodbye.